Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the quite temperate conference room here on the 9th floor of the Vaughn Center. This is the sunny side of the street, I guess. I believe I see people, well, for those who may not know who I am, I'm Don Morrill, faculty member in the MFA. Thank you. Here this evening, standing in for Erica Dawson, the director, who is on the mend, as all the students know from seeing her today, and she'll be more visible even tomorrow. So, welcome. Enjoy a great reading. I give you my fellow colleague here and the faculty, Kevin Moffett, to introduce tonight's guest, Matthew Vollmer.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's reader, Matthew Vollmer. Lately, I've been thinking about how often the impulses that we try to curb in our interactions with the people we love are the very ones that serve us best on the page in our writing. Fiction writers are constantly looking for ways to manufacture conflict. Inventing characters, giving them things to want, things to hope for, and just to see those hopes and wants dashed. Flaubert saw an inverse relationship between a writer's life and a writer's work. Live a regular and orderly life, he said, so that you can make volatile and original art. In the world, Matthew is a patient friend of mine and many other people, patient husband and father and teacher. In his writing, he's blessed with the virtue of impatience. You can see this impatience with predictable forms in his fiction and in his nonfiction, as well as impatience with standard genre distinctions like fiction and nonfiction. You can also see it on the sentence level, a writer pushing against the limitations and confines of the simple declarative sentence. This is a sentence, or actually technically two sentences, from Town Trip, a story about boys at a private Seventh-day Adventist school craving meat, which for Seventh-day Adventists is forbidden. Most of all, we wanted a reason not to visit the cafeteria, a place that had the power, even when we were starving, to arouse nausea. We wanted relief from lentil loaf and mixed vegetables, from the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches we made when we couldn't stomach the main courses, each of which was prepared for us by our peers, who were directed by our school's cook, whose name, no kidding, was Mrs. Cook, a round-cheeked woman who had taken over the role of head chef from a couple whose name, no kidding, had been Kitchen, as if these people were destined by their very names to enter the occupation of food preparation, though this fact failed, sadly, to enable them to devise appealing meals. Every sentence has a truth waiting at the end of it, says one of Don DeLillo's characters, who sounds a lot like Don DeLillo. And the writer learns how to know it when he or she finally gets there. On one level, this truth is the swing of the sentence, the beat and poise, but down deeper, it's the integrity of the writer as he or she matches with the language. I've always seen myself in sentences. The Vollmer we see in his sentences is playful and restless and impatient with conventional form and conventional thought. He's a connoisseur of formal challenges. There's a story masquerading as a last will and testament. There's a story that takes place in the form of a prayer or an advice column of a fictional 19th century physician. I didn't read this before I brought this here. Stories as breathless, sentence-long epitaphs. Vollmer's most recent book is the essay collection Permanent Exhibit, which began as a series of status updates on a popular social media platform, he coyly says on his website. I'm assuming it's Grindr, actually. Kirkus Review said, his musings on nature recall the sensibility of poet Mary Oliver, his reflections on family David Sedaris. Unexpected juxtapositions yield pleasurable surprises. Matthew's also written a pair of story collections, the previously mentioned collection of fictional epitaphs, and he's the co-editor of Fakes, an anthology of pseudo interviews, faux-letters, quasi-letters, found texts, and other fraudulent artifacts, which includes stories as Amazon reviews, stories as email exchanges, stories as police reports. Other things you should know about Matthew. He teaches writing at Virginia Tech. He's the son of a dentist. He's the recipient of an NEA grant, and he's published widely, including stories and essays in the Paris Review, Tin House, Oxford American, Epoch, The Sun, the Best American Essays, and on and on and on. The final epitaph in his book, Inscriptions for Headstones, begins, "At your feet rests a man who would, were he present, like to know why you are here, why you have come, how it is that of all the words you might read, you've chosen these." Rereading Matthew over the past few days, I'm struck by how, over the years, his writing has become more direct, as the forms have become more oblique. But no matter how unusual the story or essay form he's working in, he manages to join the heavy with the buoyant, often within the same sentence, without compromising either gravity or humor. He manages to make it look easy, too, which is the hardest thing of all. One more note on gravity, a late footnote, if you will. About 500 yards from here, I can kind of see it from where I'm standing, is a headstone dedicated to something called the Gravity Research Foundation. Some of you might know what I'm talking about, have seen it. Engraved on this headstone, it's exactly like something you'd see in a graveyard, is a somewhat ominous note that says, "This is here to remind students of the blessings forthcoming when science determines what gravity is, how it works, and how it may be controlled." It's right over there if you want to see it. I always go look at it when I'm at the residency just to make sure it's still there and it's real. It's not something I dreamed. So, what gravity is, how it works, and how it may be controlled. So tonight you have in front of you somebody who does just that, Matthew Vollmer.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Thanks, University of Tampa, for having me. I'm going to read two things tonight. One is the longest essay in this book, but it's also maybe the most relevant to this audience. Most of the essays in this book are 1 to 3 pages, and this is a little bit longer. And then I'm gonna end with a pretty short one. So, just open this water before I get started. And I may need my glasses. It's very distracting, this beautiful skyline. So it's called "We All Go Into the Dark." When I met the professor who would change my life, he was younger than I am now and did not look like a professor. I saw him in the halls of the English department at the university I was attending. I'd noted his polo shirt, slacks, and backpack and assumed that he was a non-traditional student, the sort of guy who, having given up a career in managing chain restaurants, had returned to college to finish a long-abandoned degree. The professor did not wear a blazer or tie. His head, overlarge, egg-shaped, was thick with ashen hair. His eyes bulged behind rimless glasses. His lips were as pale as the flesh of his face. In other words, the professor did not look like a man with whom anybody could become obsessed. But what did I know? I'd only been on Earth for 23 years. I'd recently moved to a generic southern city from the middle of nowhere to pursue a master's degree in English. In my spare time, I picked up shifts at a local record exchange, pricing used CDs by artists such as Limp Bizkit and Korn and TLC and Whitney Houston and Goo Goo Dolls and Destiny's Child and Sugar Ray and Smash Mouth. I worked with a morbidly obese girl who couldn't shut up about local bands, and a ponytailed redhead who loved ska, and a short blonde woman who loved Scottish chamber pop, and a gay kid who loved shoegaze. When I wasn't working, I was recording reverb-drenched songs onto 4-track cassettes and reading books assigned to me by my Brit Lit professor, who answered every question we asked by saying, "Well, that's what you got to tell me." I worked on stories for my creative writing class, which was led by a semi-famous writer, a woman whose stories and novels took place in the hollers of Appalachia, a region with which I was well acquainted, having grown up in a house in a cove at the base of a mountain on a little hill above two streams. This writing class was populated, for the most part, by a number of older women who were taking the course because it was the semi-famous writer's last semester before she retired, and these women were such unabashed fans of her work that they'd named their own children after characters from her novels. I, on the other hand, was just happy to be in a workshop at all. I had no affinity for this particular school, a land-grant university that specialized not in liberal arts, but engineering and agriculture, and had applied only because its tuition was cheap, because it offered a master's with a concentration in creative writing, and because it was where the aforementioned semi-famous writer taught, and I hoped she might take some special liking to me, as all my other writing teachers had, thus sending me up a rung higher on the ladder to wherever it was I was headed. 6 months before, I'd been working as a receptionist for a public defender in my hometown, typing up complaints and emergency custody orders on behalf of impoverished parents, and filing paperwork for the desperate and doomed, like the guy who drove his car through the plate glass window of an insurance company because the woman who worked there wouldn't return his calls. Or the nurse who killed her husband with a shotgun, packed his body in a trunk full of mothballs, and went on vacation. It was in the same law office where the lawyer would return from court, slice a few slabs of cheddar from a hunk in the mini-fridge, dip them in a jar of mayonnaise, and begin chastising me for whatever I'd done wrong that day, that I received a call from the chair of the English department at the aforementioned land-grant university, letting me know that my application for admission had been accepted. On the one hand, the chair found the low numbers on my GRE verbals distressing. On the other, he knew that words often caused a great deal of anxiety for creative writers. The department's decision then had been based on my transcripts and recommendations, the latter of which, the chair had to admit, were stellar. He regretted that the department couldn't offer me a teaching assistantship, but that was fine by me since I couldn't imagine anything more terrifying than teaching composition to a bunch of freshmen who were merely 5 years my junior. A few months later, I became an English grad student, and a few months after that, I signed up for the professor's 20th century poetry seminar, thanks to a number of students I knew who had raved about it. On the first day of class, the professor placed his hands, fingers splayed, on the table in front of him, his head swiveled slowly, unabashedly, taking in the sight of us, his students. "I can think of nothing more exciting," the professor said, "than human beings sitting down together to talk about literature." His expression, utterly blank, seemed to underscore the earnest seriousness with which he ushered this sentence into existence. And though I can't say for sure, I suppose I fell for him right then. We began class as we would every time we met by answering one by one a question of the professor's choosing. For example, "What is your most powerful childhood memory?" Or, "At one point in your life were you most embarrassed, and why?" Or, "What is the most unspeakable thing you have seen with your naked eyes?" Once everyone had answered, we opened our books to the page where the professor wanted us to begin and took turns reading aloud. We read Wallace Stevens. We read Plath and Lowell and Bishop. We read Jory Graham and Marianne Moore. The professor entered each poem we studied as if it was a familiar room in which he had lived for ages. Subsequent poems, he showed us, were simply other rooms connected one to another within the enormous house that was the canon of Western literature. In this way, the professor, like an enthusiastic tour guide, led us from room to room, revealing secret passageways in an ancient literary mansion that was forever being renovated and expanded, even as we passed through it. The professor talked about the poets we read as though they were old friends, and in some cases he had spent time, real actual time with them. He talked about James Merrill and his partner, David Jackson, how they placed their hands on a homemade Ouija board and summoned messages from long-dead poets. He told us about how Frank O'Hara scribbled poems on cocktail napkins during his lunch breaks at the Museum of Modern Art. He described how Wallace Stevens composed poems while walking from his house to his office in Hartford, Connecticut, and how the poet rarely traveled, except for annual trips to his beloved Florida Keys, and how he cherished gifts he received from people all over the world, as well as how he could spend an entire afternoon with an orange. Studying its peeling, turning it over, relishing its color, and the texture as light played upon its surface. The fragrant spray of mist as his nails tore into the peel, the sweetness flooding his mouth as his teeth bit into its flesh, and how these intensely present moments for Stevens constituted heaven, which meant that there was no need for another. During our discussions of these poets, the professor flattered us with attention and appeared at all times to be completely absorbed in everything we said, never disparaging anyone, no matter how dumb our responses. If any of us offered a confounding or implausible interpretation, he'd say, "Where do you see that?" And if we said something stupid, he'd ask us to say more about that. And if we said something funny, he would unleash a kind of unself-conscious machine gun giggle. And if we said something smart, he'd say, "That's genius." The frustrating thing was, though the professor demanded excellence, he offered zero guidance about how exactly we should go about achieving it. When we asked him what he was looking for and the papers we were to write, he said simply, "Be brilliant." And because he invited us to visit him during office hours, to talk about our paper ideas, or to share writing that we'd written outside the classroom, I brought him a short story of mine to read. This particular story had been based on a family I'd observed 2 summers before while visiting a friend in Nebraska, and centered on a woman who'd married a former place kicker, but had secretly been seeing a poet named Todd, a sickly-looking dude who worked as a teller at a racetrack. "This is good," the professor told me, "but 400 people in America could write this exact story. You need to write the story only you can write." I was surprised by the frankness of this assessment. Every teacher I'd ever had, including the semi-famous Appalachian, who'd simply called my stories wild and insisted without reservation that she loved them, had always praised my work. Furthermore, I was surprised to learn that the professor himself wrote fiction. I assumed all professors of literature churned out literary criticism and little else because they had no interest in, or lacked the talent, to produce fiction or poetry. "I write constantly," the professor said. "In fact, I'm never not writing." Had he published anything? He shrugged. A few stories in respectable, if little read, journals, the title of which, using library databases, I immediately sought out and tracked down, scouring each one for clues that might unlock secrets about the professor, whose voice, now that I was spending a couple hours a week in his office, often replayed itself in my head. His peculiar brain tape unspooled phrases like, "Literature is everything," and "It's really the only thing," and "Every story needs to be revised at least 70 times." And "There's no reason at all to write short stories unless they're absolutely amazing and unforgettable." And "I worry that you don't realize that James Salter is God." And "I worry that you think someone else is." And "There is no God. And when you realize this, your writing will get miraculously even better." On this latter subject, the professor and I agreed to disagree, but it didn't make me like him any less because he was, at least in my mind, a genius when it came to interpreting texts and connecting them to other texts and making sweeping gestures about writerly idiosyncrasies like, "Most poets don't use kitchens in this way," or "That's never what a flaming cloud means." If it hasn't already been made clear, I hung on every word the professor spoke and latched onto every detail of his biography, which for reasons known only to him, he was far less interested in sharing. Still, I learned that his father had been a famous professor at Princeton, a man who oversaw a cult-like following and who left his wife, the professor's mother, for a younger woman who had been a student. As a child, the professor had visited Israel and had been left alone in a hotel room where, to pass the time, he read the Bible out loud to himself, hypnotizing himself with the Psalms, letting the words rush through his body like a kind of fevered electricity. The professor had graduated from an Ivy League school, which meant that he knew famous literary critics, one of whom was a personal friend and mentor. In the 80s in New York City, the professor had often stayed up all night drinking and snorting cocaine and having intense conversations with people who were brilliant about literature. Those days, however, were behind him. He'd been sober for years. But he encouraged me and others to live our lives as we had because we were young and could get away with it. For all these reasons and more, the professor became my favorite person. There was no one in the world I wanted to please more, no one I would rather talk to. But the professor had a wife and 2 children, and I wasn't the only student in his classes who felt the way I did, as evidenced by the line of people at his door and the way he had to say when visitors overstayed their welcomes, "I have to kick you out now." In order to ensure a regularly scheduled sit-down with the professor, I signed up for an independent study with him, a course in contemporary American fiction. We read All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy and Been Down So Long It Looks Like Up to Me by Richard Farina and Jesus' Son by Dennis S. Johnson by fall break. When, to visit a friend who was majoring in theater at NYU, I flew to New York City. This friend lived with her dollhouse-sized plumbing and appliances in a spectacularly tiny one-bedroom apartment above a pizza parlor on 6th Avenue, across the street from the famous basketball courts. The professor who loved New York gave me an assignment before I left: document everything. So I did. While the friend I had come to visit was in class, I walked for miles, just as I imagined Frank O'Hara had, and as the professor himself would have done. There I was in Midtown, walking through valleys of the shadow of concrete cliffs. There I was in Chinatown, eyeballing squid nestled in slushy beds of ice. There I was in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, viewing paintings from the 15th century, angels hovering on wings of exotic bird feathers, the hells aswarm with aquatic monsters. There I was with my friend, high on ecstasy I'd scored from a kid back at the State University who hated that everybody he said wrote like Faulkner, even though he did. There we were walking at 3 a.m. down 6th Avenue, which was as bright and teeming as rush hour. When I returned to the university, the professor asked me to read what I'd written out loud. He insisted that work be read aloud whenever possible, and I did. The professor laughed. He said, "That's so great." He said, "That's brilliant." He told me to forget the reading for the next week and instead work on what I'd written into a story. So, because I did everything the professor asked, I wrote a story about a kid who, wandering around the Met, spots a cute redhead and follows her throughout the city, a story which, to my fragile delight, the professor loved. "This is why I will never be a real writer, and you will be," he said, pointing out how I used the adjective ribbed to describe a water bottle. "You're on fire," he said. "Write another story and bring it next week." Even though I was not in the habit of writing a story in as little time as a week, I wrote another one. And then I wrote another, and another, and another, and another, and another. And in 8 weeks, I wrote 8 stories. Thanks to the professor and to the tall blonde woman I met in a Shakespeare class where we laughed like middle schoolers at archaic words like bunghole, a woman who would later become my wife, I felt more alive and more purposeful than ever. I was becoming, or so I imagined, what I'd wanted to be for so long, a writer. I had one goal, to keep going. "You'll get in everywhere," said the professor when I told him I was applying to MFA programs, and he gladly wrote me recommendations, handing them to me in sealed envelopes with his name scrawled along the flap seam. Because I decided in the end not to apply to one of these programs, and therefore didn't need the recommendation that the professor had supplied, and because I was burning with curiosity to know what the professor might have said about me, I opened the envelope and read the letter, which was succinctly evaluative in exactly the way that the professor levied judgments. "He is the real thing," the professor wrote. "I recommend him in the highest possible terms." As high as this praise made me, and as absolutely convinced as I was that one of the 5 schools I'd applied to would accept me, none did. However, thank you. However, I did end up striking a kind of gold. Despite my lack of experience, I received an offer to teach from a small liberal arts college in Massachusetts, the same one that I'd attended as an undergraduate. So I moved to Massachusetts, where I lived in the attic of a 200-year-old house whose space I shared with twin sisters and their one-eyed grandmother. I taught and wrote stories and pined for the girlfriend who would become my wife. I also kept in touch with the professor and continued to send him stories. In fact, for years after I had graduated from the State University, I sent the professor everything I wrote, printing out stories and sealing them in envelopes stuffed with SASEs, self-addressed stamped envelopes for the younger people in the crowd, so he could quickly send them back, which he always did after marking them up and scribbling smiley faces next to underlined passages he thought were funny and drawing stars next to the underlined or bracketed sentence he found powerful. In some sense, everything I wrote for the professor, for the regressive sake of summoning those smiley faces and stars. There was nothing like opening the mailbox to find an envelope bearing the postmark of the city where the professor resided, or to open my email account to find a message from him. Inside there was praise. I'm thrilled you finished Gravity's Rainbow. You have just vindicated your entire generation. There were morbid existential reflections. Instead of happy birthday, people should sing dark, dark, dark. They all go into the dark. There might be instructions. I sort of want to see Fight Club, but I never will. It's supposed to be funny. Tell me the jokes. They were disparaging updates about a class he was teaching. Today, people said that Stein wrote that way because she was rich, as if the minute they themselves got some money, they'd turn into geniuses. Something they'd been putting off because they couldn't afford it. And the professor chided me for wasting time. I don't really understand the whole concept of telling someone a story before you've written it. It's like saying, I'm going to write a song and it's going to go like this. Just write it. He gave me encouragement. You were meant to be a writer. You are prodigiously talented as a writer. Of course, you are going to sound like other writers. Occasionally, it will be a little bit too much, and then you have to fix that, which won't always be easy. You have to be psychotically thick-skinned until you make it an after. He scolded me for my impatience. Your stories, like mine and everybody's, need time and dozens of rewrites, and offered summaries of my work. I never think of your stories as relentlessly dark. You yourself are, as a person, very happy, and your very smart decision is to turn that happiness into linguistic energy. All your stories are essentially comic, I think. Many of them have moments of sadness, but I think at this point in your life, you know pretty little about loss. In short, it didn't matter what the professor said, really, as long as his direction was directed, however briefly, toward me. And after my wife were married in an Anglican church where the professor presided over the scripture reading, and we moved to Indiana where my wife would begin pursuing a PhD, I began teaching first-year composition and reading for the university's literary magazine, the editor of which encouraged me to solicit work from writers I admired. And because the professor fell into this category, I asked him to send me something. Much to my surprise, he did. The story was about a man whose wife had left him for another man with whom she had had a baby, and after the baby's father had died, the woman moved in with another woman, despite the fact that the man, the first one, the main character, begged her to return to him. The story established fairly quickly that this man, who was the main character, had become unhinged. He saw snow falling everywhere and was visited by the ghost of his dead father, who instructed him to visit the home of his ex-wife and to leave said home with the ex-wife's baby. It wasn't just a good story, it was the definition in my eyes of an absolute bona fide masterpiece. And like all stories written by the professor, it seemed to provide psychological insights into the enigma that was his life. It didn't even matter to me in the end that another, more prestigious literary journal accepted the professor's story, meaning that the little magazine I was reading for could not publish it. The fact that it existed and that I'd read it was enough. And though the professor and I remained in contact with one another, we corresponded less frequently, largely because my wife and I were now parents, with a new baby to take care of, a baby who seemed never to be satisfied, a baby who cried and fussed almost constantly unless we were carrying him around outside. Once he had grown big enough to sit in a backpack, I spent hours every day walking him around the Midwestern town where we lived, in rain and sun and snow and wind, because this was the only thing that would satisfy this boy. If I had to go to the grocery store or the bank or the library, I always took him in the backpack. And because he was a baby, an especially handsome baby, I will say, someone always smiled at us or made a comment about his face or hair or eyes or about me and what a good father I was. And the thought eventually occurred to me that these assumptions stranger made about me were absurd because I might, in theory, be on my way to committing any number of crimes simply by taking advantage of the fact that I was carrying a baby in a backpack. Of course, I didn't actually commit a crime with my son in a backpack, but I did write a story in which a character carrying a backpack with a baby plans to commit a crime. And when I sent a draft of this particular story to the professor, I was still sending him stories on occasion. He was still reading them and marking them up with stars and smiley faces and sending them back. His response included an allegation that by using a similar piece of baby equipment as he had for a central prop in my story, I was ripping him off. In other words, the story that he had written about the man who attempted to steal his ex-wife's baby had shown up on her doorstep wearing a snuggly, which is a kind of baby-carrying equipment, albeit the type to carry younger babies, namely infants, tightly against the chest of the wearer, while I too, by giving my character a backpack in which a child is carried, had done something suspiciously similar. Not only that, The professor claimed that this was part of an ongoing pattern, that I tended to put stuff from his stories into my stories, and then instead of stealing from him, I should do what he did, which was to A, steal from the great writers, and B, people I didn't know. I reread the email. I stared at his emphatic instruction, "Don't rip me off!" Exclamation point. It seemed like a joke. It couldn't be real. I had stolen it from life, my life, and my life had been stolen by my mentor. I had written a story based on my experience of carrying a baby, my own child, in a backpack. I hadn't imagined and refused to imagine now that I had borrowed, much less stolen, anything whatsoever from the professor. After all, the man in his story never carried a baby anywhere, and therefore the empty snuggly he wore to the house of his ex became a symbol of his powerlessness. Whereas the man in my story was an actual father carrying an actual child, partly because the child was his own, and partly because he knew that no one would suspect a child-carrying father of committing a crime. When I replied to the professor with these concerns, he said that he had taken a poll of his writer friends, not mentioning my name, and asked them what they thought about someone writing a story using that same piece of baby equipment in a central way. They, that is, the professor writer's friends, whoever they were, thought it was a little bizarre and wondered if I was just very naive or oblivious to the way that writers treat each other. The professor pointed out to his friends that I had the same experience, and one of them said, "We all have the same experience. Everybody has the same experience." The professor then said that even though one of the most appealing things about me was my innocence, for God's sake, did he really have to explain how the fact that I'd written a story using that particular prop in a central way was bizarre? The professor then claimed that he constantly had experiences after which he said, "Wow, that was in that story by so-and-so. Now I can't use it." It would never occur to him to say, "Hey, it happened to me. It came directly from my own experience." The relationship between life and art was more complicated and subtle than that. Part of my experience, the professor said, was my experience of the story he'd written. How could I not know that? Sorry if this basic lesson is a mindfuck to you, the professor concluded. These sentences bore into me as painfully and effortlessly as nails heated over a fire. Don't rip me off. Sorry if this basic lesson is a mindfuck. The professor just wasn't my teacher. He had been, or so I'd like to imagine, my literary father, a man whose brain, at least when it came to reading and interpreting stories and novels and poems, I admired more than any other. For years, he had engaged honestly and intelligently with my work for no other reason, or so I had to assume, than to help me improve. I knew that I wasn't his favorite student. There was a woman he praised openly and often in my presence who had published work in the New Yorker and who, much to my chagrin, had been published in the New Writers issue of the Paris Review, where the second story I'd ever published had also appeared. But I like to think that I was at least one of his favorites, or had been anyway until now. I called my wife over to the computer. I asked her what she thought. She didn't like it either. That is, she thought the charge was weird, that the professor was weird, that I should write what I want, that I should forget about him, that my relationship with him wasn't all that healthy to begin with, and that he was probably deep down jealous. But it wasn't that easy. I owed much to the professor. I knew that others had claimed he was manipulative, that he was jealous of other students, that he was capable of hurting those who admired him, but I wanted to think I was different, that I was a category unto myself, a kind of literary son upon whom admiration and perhaps even love might be doled out unconditionally from a reserve that could never be depleted. Even so, the next time I finished a draft of a story, I decided, perhaps because I wanted to avoid being stung, not to send it to the professor. Nor did I send the professor the next story I wrote, or the next. In fact, I never sent him another story, never asked him to provide me with so-called feedback on anything. I did not email him regularly, and he did not email me. And so in this way, we drifted apart. If the professor ever thought about me, ever wondered what I was up to, he refrained from asking, though if on occasion curiosity got the best of me and I sent out a short email as a kind of exploratory probe, he would supply after a time an obligatory message, what he was teaching, what he'd been reading, the last best film he'd seen, etc. But even these bare-bones missives resonated with the stentorian authority of a voice steeped in the drama of the literary life, which was for me the central essence of his power and allure. Years passed. My wife and I and our son moved to a plateau on the Blue Ridge Mountains to work at a university where we still teach. Eventually, I published a book. Even though I hadn't spoken to the professor in years, I decided to send him a copy. After all, no one else had a more significant influence in my writing. Without him, I supposed the book never would have been written. I didn't expect him to respond, much less to take the time to read it, but a few months later I opened my computer and found an email bearing the professor's name. The message inside was brief, just long enough to say that he had indeed read my book and found it to be fantastically conceived, if not perfectly executed. In fact, he said he wished he had written it. I stared at this message in much the same way I had stared a decade before at the phrase, "Don't rip me off." I wanted to believe that what the professor said was true and that I'd finally become what I dreamed long ago of becoming, i.e. the kind of writer who'd earned, through hard work and determination, the professor's unabashed admiration. And though I read the words fantastic and not perfectly executed over and over, I couldn't quite believe either was true, the good or the bad. I worried, as I do to this day, that it was some kind of backhanded compliment, that he was both telling me exactly what I wanted to hear and taking it all back, while knowing that the mixture of praise and criticism would have a stupefying effect upon me and cause me to leave him alone. After all, he once said when I complained about some of my fellow students in one of my creative writing classes that I shouldn't worry too much about their various insufficiencies, because most people who took creative writing classes were morons. And what all of them longed for, secretly, shamefully, was abuse. Verbal mostly, and oceans of it. At the time, his remark made me laugh because I thought it might be true, and because the professor had almost always seemed right, even when he was wrong, but also because I no longer thought, not even for a minute, that he might be talking about me. All right, I'm gonna read another short one, just to sort of clear the air. And this is very short. It's called Good Old Leon, which is not, as you might expect, a play on the Wallace story, Good Old Neon. The writer Dennis Johnson, who now is dead, once explained to a group of people, among whom I happened to be a member, that the fear of the apocalypse was really only a fear of personal annihilation. Johnson got clean, but not soon enough to grow old. There are days when the world feels emptier without him, and days when I think he's one of the lucky ones. Like today, when winds from the polar vortex are madly playing the wind chimes, and the cat won't stop attacking the furniture, and I assign too much reading and writing because that's what I do to mask the truth, growing more evident each passing day that I don't know what the ever-loving fuck I'm doing. It's on days like these that I can't help but wonder, why does life have to be so long? Or as one of my former students once wrote in the best in-class writing exercise I've ever received, during which she fantasized about a stranger shooting her in the head and thanking him for saving her, what am I going to do with my long string of tomorrows? That's when I remember that I need to put into writing that my wish is to be buried and to convince my wife to be buried there with me, and what my father calls the family plot, a clearing behind my parents' house in the mountains of North Carolina that isn't big enough probably to hold all the relatives that also imagine it to be their final resting places. My father texted last night to say that our friend Leon had died and that he didn't know any more than that, and good night because he was going to bed. Good old Leon, I thought. My sister, who texted me the other day to say that our mother had seemed worse than when she'd seen her at Christmas, had worn this look of utter confusion in the mornings and stood before the front windows at night, thinking she saw things in the darkness, with no words to say what she thought they might be, texted my father and me good night. Ignoring their attempts at ending the conversation, I texted back, "Not the Leon," and my father replied with yes, and he'd had Alzheimer's. I knew the picture in my head of Leon, a short, stocky, balding man with a mustache and a slow drawl who was funny and kind and for some reason, like me, cheered for the Dallas Cowboys, was painfully outdated and could hardly bear to imagine what he'd looked like at the moment of his death. He'd been married for many years to a woman named Ellen, who happened to be the ex-wife of one of my mother's cousins. Ellen and Leon used to visit us, and we them, and once my sister and I spent a weekend there while my parents went on vacation to Aruba or some such exotic locale, and the only memories I have of that weekend are dancing to Michael Jackson's Beat It as it played on a big Zenith in Ellen and Leon's master bedroom, and visiting Leon's store. He ran a convenience mart, and in one of the aisles there were a selection of cheap toys from which we were allowed to make selections, And I remember thinking how cool it would be to own a store, to waltz in and take whatever you wanted whenever you wanted it, as if that was actually how it worked. This, I suppose, is the extent of what I remember about Leon, other than that he was what you might call a smooth operator. Maybe wore a leather jacket or those glasses that turned to sunglasses when the sun hit them, and that he always greeted my mother with a long hug and kiss on the cheek, which seemed borderline lascivious, as if he might be reveling in the chance to embrace a woman who was not his wife, a characteristic greeting which once prompted my sister to order him not to do that because he wasn't my mother's husband. Good old Leon, I thought. How many people like me hadn't had the chance to say goodbye? Deader in hell, as my father might say, allowing himself to swear because he wasn't saying the word in earnest, but simply repeating a phrase he'd picked up from or had heard his parents or staff at his dental office use. Therefore, it wouldn't have been cruel for my father to say that, and Leon might have laughed had he heard, but the cruelest thing was the way he died, eaten from the inside out, his brain erased. Leon became a ghost that primarily haunted the ones he loved most. Is it fair to call a living person, my own dear mother, for instance, who used to play piano and write letters and make the world's best vegetarian meatballs, but who can no longer retrieve a glass of water from the sink by herself, a ghost? I recently watched online a video of a young man whose facial features I could not distinguish. They had been digitally blurred to hide his identity. This young man had purportedly time-traveled from the year 2030 and was holding a black and white map showing to what extent the coastline had been erased due to rising ocean levels. California was gone. Most of Oregon and Washington, all but a smidge of Florida. Most of South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, even the mountains where I now reside. The picture might have served as a representation of my mother's brain or Leon's, or, on some future day, of mine, my beaches and mountains and amber waves of grain churned to oblivion, and my alphabet with it, and therefore no way for me to supply a final report, no way, except for now, while I'm in my right mind, and therefore before the great forgetting begins, to say goodbye. Thanks. What? Oh.
Anyone? You're all stunned.
Yeah.
What was the choice like between not naming people and places in your first essay, but naming people and places in your second?
Great question. Yeah. Well, first of all, I didn't want to get sued. And the first one, and most of the time I find myself not using names, and so that was basically it. I mean, and sometimes I find that a name is less descriptive than or evocative than a title, you know. So I'll, depending on that, that's sort of how I operate. And then the last one, I think Leon. I just love the name Leon, and so I had to use Leon. And I tend to use the names of people who are dead. If people are dead, then I take your name. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Anything like that. I think it's a really tricky thing these days because, I think a lot of people don't have the reference points that you're looking for. So, I was just wondering,
Was there a place where you were lost, like you didn't get a reference, or?
No. I understand it, but I just wonder, how you, as a writer, sort of approach things that you use as a cultural reference point, and then knowing that people maybe would not understand that.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, the bands that I listed, you know, like Limp Bizkit and the Goo Goo Dolls. I mean, those are just silly names. So I want to import those. But in other times, it's I just want to defamiliarize. I want to, instead of or I'll say land grant university, or I'll just, instead of saying Game of Thrones, which I haven't seen, I'll say like, a show about dragons and whatever. I mean, whatever that show is about. And people who get killed off every episode, like whatever it is. So it's I just sort of approach it instinctually, and then go back and look at it and say like, well, oh, did I say The Sopranos, or did I say, HBO drama about a crime family or a mob family? And I think it is, there's no, I mean, as for anything, there's no one right answer, but it's sort of like, what sort of linguistic energy can you generate by making one choice or the other, and what does it evoke in either way, whether you actually name it or you sort of describe what the references and draw it out a little bit more. Yeah. Yep.
Do you think of episodes or themes, 50-50, one more than the other?
In Game of Thrones?
No, in your essays. Do you draw from episodes more or themes more?
So I was writing these in, I basically wrote this entire book between July 2016 and December 2016, or maybe January 2016. And I wrote, my first assignment for myself was, could I write, because I wrote one and then I wrote another really, really quickly. I said, could I write one of these every day for 10 days? And I did that, and then I was like, well, could I write one like every other day? Could I write one every 3 days? Could I write one once a week? Whatever. And I think, because I didn't know what I was going to write about, it was just, I was focusing on what I saw in the day, whether it was like when I went online and saw, another policeman had shot a black man, or it was like I was on a bike ride and I saw a crow eating pieces of popcorn outside of a movie theater and thought, lucky. I mean, it was just like, it was like these, I was just paying attention to everything because I needed a break from reality, even as I was entering deeper into it, right? So then, of course, themes and preoccupations of my own just naturally popped up. And I never thought like, oh, I'm going to write about, police brutality, but that is a theme. I'm not going to write about gun violence. I'm going to write about gun violence. It just kept making itself known, and I would slip it into the essay. And that's usually what I do. I mean, I follow instincts and try to improvise as much as possible, and just trust that. I mean, it doesn't always work out, but when it does, I feel like it does generate a sort of rhythm and momentum, and so.